Hey guys, it's me again. And just like any other human being in the United States, I've always wondered who decides on how large the monetary base should be. Well, within the United States, the answer would be the Federal Reserve, or otherwise known as the Fed. You can kind of say that the Federal Reserve is the central bank, which it is, for the institution pretty much regulates the banking system and, as I said before, monetary base. Okay, so what initially sparked the creation of the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve was a response to the Panic of 1907. What was the Panic of 1907? The Panic of 1907 was a financial crisis that considerably altered our economy, most likely rooted by retracted liquidity on assets. The crisis caused bank runs to occur. Luckily, a wealthy man by the name of J.P. Morgan and other wealthy men, like an example would be John D. Rockefeller, established their own reserves to allow people to be assured that they can withdraw their money. The panic stopped. However, the U.S. was put into a 4-year recession, and the unemployment rate it went from 3% to 8%. After this crisis, the federal government wanted to reform the banking system. The Federal Reserve was established to eliminate the national banking system at the time and served as an institution that would hold an adequate amount of reserves, open to inspections, obviously. The Federal Reserve was also given the right to issue currency in order to maintain money supply sufficiently, resulting in a satisfied economic condition. Now let's talk about the structure of the Federal Reserve. In spite of being an institution of such high status, it isn't exactly part of the United States government, surprisingly. The Federal Reserve System is made up of the Board of Governors and the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The Board of Governors, whose offices are located in Washington, D.C., oversee the system. These beings are appointed by the government and approved by the Senate. To avoid political pressure when conducting monetary policy, these individuals serve 14-year terms, with obviously the exception of the chair. The chair serves 4-year terms, but it's traditional that they serve longer terms after being reappointed. The 12 Federal Reserve banks each serve a certain region, known as the Federal Reserve Districts. The board of directors for each of these banks are appointed by the local banking and business communities. The New York Federal Reserve Bank has a unique role, and that would be carrying out open market operations, a tool of monetary policy. More on that later. The decisions of monetary policy are done by the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, which is essentially the Board of Governors and 5 other regional bank presidents. The ultimate goal is to provide a structure where economy can be maintained in the long term and avoid political pressure in the short term. Now, I may have mentioned what the Federal Reserve does, but how exactly does the Federal Reserve System function? Their functions fall under 4 categories: providing financial services, supervising and regulating banking institutions, maintaining the stability of financial systems, and finally conducting monetary policy. By providing financial services, we can say that the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank, for they hold reserves, clear checks, provide cash, and transfer funds to commercial banks, the same services commercial banks give to their customers. The Federal Reserve System is also in charge of examination and regulation of commercial banks, making sure that the financial system is stable and safe. And one of their most important functions is conducting monetary policy by using several tools to prevent macroeconomic fluctuations. So now, how does the Federal Reserve perform their functions? At their hands, they possess 3 policy tools: reserve requirements, the discount rate, and open market operations. Banks must maintain a sufficient amount of reserves to meet up with the Fed's required reserve ratio. If a bank cannot meet that ratio, they face penalties. To avoid these penalties, banks usually borrow additional reserves from other banks through the federal funds market. Within this market, the supply and demand determines the interest rate, but the supply and demand is affected by whatever actions the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve can change reserve requirements to alter money supply. Decreasing the required reserve ratio will increase the money multiplier, which in turn increases money supply. When the Fed increases the required reserve ratio, the money multiplier decreases, causing the money supply to decrease. It's important to note that the Fed doesn't change the reserve requirements actively, with the last major change being in 1992. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve applies onto banks loaning from them. Say that a bank is in need of reserves. They can buy the reserves from the Federal Reserve through the discount window. The discount rate is usually 1% above the federal funds rate. That way, the banks don't immediately go to the Federal Reserve in need of reserves. The Fed can change the discount rate, resulting in a change in money supply. By reducing the difference between the discount rate and the federal funds rate, banks respond by increasing lending. This means that through the money multiplier, the money supply increases. If the Fed increases the difference between the discount rate and the federal funds rate, the money supply will decrease, again because of the money multiplier. Although the discount rate is a tool of monetary policy, it isn't used to the extent of open market operations. The best way of explaining open market operations is through a T chart. You're not going to believe this, but a T account chart is in the shape of a T. I know, it surprised me when I heard it for the first time. When making this T account, you first make a T. So this is going to be sort of a reference T account chart. On one side we have assets. On the other side we have liabilities. Under assets we have government debt or treasury bills. So government debt, aka treasury bills. And under liabilities, we have monetary base. Monetary base. Under monetary base, we have the currency and circulation. And we have bank reserves. Now that we're done with that reference T account chart, let's make two situations with the Federal Reserve. Purchase of $100 million US dollars. So let's first make the T. Surprisingly, it's a T account chart. Alright, make the T. Alright, then we label one side assets and the other side liabilities. And since we're talking about the Federal Reserve, we're going to put the Federal Reserve name right here. So an open market purchase of $100 million US dollars occurred. This means that treasury bills would increase by $100 million. So treasury bills plus $100 million. Under liabilities, this would mean that the monetary base would also increase by $100 million US dollars. So monetary base and plus $100 million US dollars. Now what happens to the T accounts of commercial banks? Let's visualize it with the T account chart. Alright, so we're going to make the T again, surprisingly. Then we're going to put assets. And then we're going to put liabilities. Now, since we're talking about commercial banks, we're going to put commercial banks here to specify this is the T account of commercial banks. Okay, so back to the original problem. There's an open market purchase of $100 million. That means that the Federal Reserve has attained $100 million. What does that mean in terms of commercial banks? This means that the treasury bills of commercial banks has subtracted by $100 million. Oh shoot, I messed up the word million, but who cares? Alright, it doesn't end there. Commercial banks also have reserves. So we're going to label reserves. And in this case, in reserves, we have $100 million US dollars. Million. I keep messing up. 100 million. And then we're going to put the dollars. There's no change in liabilities. So there's going to be no change. So what is the result? This will ultimately lead to an increase in money supply through the money multiplier as banks lend out more of these new reserves. Now our second case is an open market sale of $100 million US dollars. So in terms of treasury bills under Federal Reserve, this would mean minus 100 million US dollars. So treasury bills, and that will be minus 100 million US dollars. Now, under liabilities, the monetary base also decreases by 100 million US dollars. So monetary base, that's going to decrease by 100 million. Now, how do commercial banks get impacted by this? So when the Federal Reserve sells 100 million, the commercial banks gain 100 million US dollars in treasury bills. So under treasury bills for commercial banks, let me make some room, bills, we get plus 100 million. This would mean that the reserves decrease by 100 million US dollars. So reserves negative 100 million US dollars. And under liabilities, again, there is no change. The result of this case will be a fall in the money supply due to the money multiplier, meaning that banks would reduce the amount of loans in response to their fall in reserves.
I'm sorry for the sore throat in this video. I just want to get this out there. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. Notable mentions obviously include Mr. Graham, my AP Macro teacher, the students in my AP Macro class, my family obviously, and I guess everyone watching this video. Thank you for watching.
Avoid political pressure. Oh God, voice crack.